Chapter 7. Asuncion, Paraguay, October. John and Dieter, wearing identical sunglasses and solemn expressions, stood beside the grave of Victor Grigo, amid the scruffy grass, wilted flowers, and pictures of solemn dark faces fixed to the tombstones. With their hands clasped before them, they bowed their heads and read, Victor Grigo, 1938 to 2001. She was hit by a bus. That'd refer to his mother, I suppose, John said. Dieter glanced at him. I was told that she died of a broken heart. John shrugged. That's probably why she walked in front of a bus. Poor woman. Dieter sighed. I may not have been an ideal son, but I didn't drive my mother to suicide. Bastard. John agreed. I guess this means that you still own the cache of weapons, Dieter said, and turned away. Yep. John read the tombstone one more time and shook his head. What a louse, he muttered, and picking up his backpack, turned to join Dieter. My flight is at 4. Guess I'd better get going. With a knowing smile, Dieter asked, Nervous? Yeah, I guess. Don't worry, John. It's a good disguise. Your own mother wouldn't recognize you. John snorted. Well, maybe your mother would, von Rossbach conceded. But that's about it. John gave him a quick glance. What about you? Don't worry about me. I've got something in play, Dieter said. He held out his hand and they shook. I'll see you in New Mexico. If they're letting people into that state by then. John hailed a taxi. They will be, Dieter said confidently. He opened the door to the cab. It's a big state. John flung his backpack into the back seat and got in behind it. Be careful, he called out the window to Dieter. Dieter raised one brow. Funny, I was just about to say the same thing to you. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. John wore a weedy-looking black goatee and moustache, and a pair of black horn-rim glasses. He looked nervous and intellectual, and nothing like his usual self. His body language was deferential as he went through American customs, as though he were leaving home for the first time, like the young man on his way to college that he was. Of course, he was on his way to college to plot and plan and recruit minions, not to study, but he'd look like he belonged. He was nervous, but genuinely happy to be going. He was so looking forward to meeting Wendy. She was only 8 months older than he was, for all she kept calling him kid. He was hoping it wasn't going to be an issue. It was important to keep the recruits' respect. Yeah, right, he thought. Too honest by habit to kid himself for long. She's gorgeous and brilliant and I like her. Consequently, he wanted her to like him. It bothered him that he was thinking like this because he knew it was frivolous. He had no time for frivolous. The guy behind the desk finished looking at John's passport and asked a few questions, obviously pro forma, then waved him on his way. John was pleased as well as relieved. It was only about a year and a few months since their attack on Cyberdyne, after all. There would have been computer-aged photos of himself on every custom officer's desk for a long while. They must not have been very good, John thought. He put his carry bag on the belt and went through the metal detector, grabbing his bag on the other side. The alarm went off just after him, and the guards gathered scowling as a middle-aged man in a Hawaiian shirt with a grey and blonde beard opened his bag. "It's just diving equipment," the man said in exasperation. "I'm a writer on vacation." John smiled. It was convenient having a fuss right after he went through. That would fix itself in people's memories, and he'd be less than a shadow. In a few hours, he'd be a guest at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he was really looking forward to it. John didn't think that even if it had been an option, he would have ended up at MIT. He'd heard about New England winters and wasn't all that interested in experiencing one for himself. When he thought of himself as an American, he thought of California. Brie nibbling, skateboarding, sun and surfing, indulging political absurdities at Berkeley, or engineering department practical jokes at UCLA. While he was heading for Massachusetts, Dieter was on his way by more devious routes to California. They'd both felt it was time to meet some of the people they'd been talking to on the internet to see if they could be turned into more serious recruits. It was John's idea to offer the MIT folks some proof about Skynet. Some of them were asking difficult questions about what they were doing. He understood the risk he was taking, but he also knew that sooner or later they were going to have to know. Now was as good a time as any. It wasn't going to be enough to have scattered individuals gathering information. After Judgment Day, he was going to need trained, educated people in key positions, or they were never going to be able to defeat Skynet. He'd have to pick and train them now to make sure they lived through the first volleys of nuclear missiles. His father hadn't given details of how the humans had managed to shatter Skynet's defense grid, but it couldn't have been plain old brute strength. There had to have been scientists, engineers, planners. Now, if ever, was the time to find them. John had the Terminator's CPU in his pocket, disguised as a chocolate bar. He and Dieter had retrieved it before returning to Paraguay. Handling it reminded him of the Terminator's head trying to bite him. He had a brief flash of that Terminator attacking their plane as they left the Caymans, of how, even with its body blown away, the head had kept trying to fight. But the brains at MIT would know it for what it was, a technology far beyond anything available today. At least, he hoped they would. It was all the proof he had. Although, as proof goes, it's pretty damned amazing, he thought. Buenos Aires, Argentina. Vera Fillmore glanced at the brief resume in her hand and then looked over the top of the page at the divine creature standing before her desk. Wolf Ingolfsson, the resume said his name was, It suited him. True, he was no spring chicken, but in her experience, the young ones were boring. And those shoulders, ay caramba! They made a wonderful silhouette against the broad windows and the thronging masts of the yacht basin. Vera enjoyed traveling the world with a boatload of handsome, charming young men. But these days it was mostly look and don't touch. This big fella might be a different case. He was certainly old enough to have been around the block a few times. So flirting, at least, could be added to the program. Dieter looked at her with a blandly pleasant expression on his face. There were no chairs before Miss Fillmore's desk, indicating that she didn't like her employees to get too comfortable in her presence. On the other hand, the way she kept running her eyes up and down his body suggested that she might make an exception in select cases. About 50, Vera was very trim and well groomed. The color of her hair, the pale gold froth of champagne, was not found in nature. But it suited her, as did the expensive baubles she wore and the bright red silk shirt and black toreador pants. Some women had the personality to carry off almost anything. "You don't seem to have had much experience as a deckhand," she commented. "Not as an employee," he agreed. "But I have been on boats of all kinds since I was a boy." "Ah," Vera said coyly. "Your daddy was rich, was he?" "No, he was a fisherman. But when I was a teenager, I often got day jobs on some of the yachts along the Côte d'Azur. My friends and I would work for free just to get on board." He smiled reminiscently. "I love the sea." Vera gave him her most charming smile and reflected that no one worked for free. Somehow she thought he was familiar. Not as though she'd met him, but as though she'd seen him somewhere. Well, if she did decide to hire him, she'd have him investigated, as always, despite his references being in order. But she certainly hoped he checked out. The man was intriguing, and she was perennially bored. "Well then," she said, rising, "we'll be in touch." He looked a little uncertain as he gently took her hand. "I'm staying at the Sailor's Rest," he said. She nodded, still smiling. "You'll be hearing from us." He turned and walked out, and she enjoyed the view. The guy had a great butt. Vera sighed appreciatively. "I hope he isn't shy." Dieter fully expected to be hired. It had been several years since he'd last used this persona, but he'd updated it a bit before leaving home. He'd applied with several skippers, but he was banking on Fillmore. So much so that he'd bribed one of her hands to jump ship. She was perfect for his purposes. Her itinerary would take her through the Panama Canal and up to San Diego within the next 10 days. Shielded by her prestige and money, he would be able to slip into the US without the more stringent customs scrutiny he might get at an airport. Like it or not, he was fairly distinctive looking. Besides, he honestly thought Vera Fillmore was just the sort of rich eccentric he might be able to recruit for their project. She had a sense of adventure and independence that was rare, and money to burn. It would be nice not to have to rely completely on his underworld contacts. The only thing that worried him was the light in her eyes when she looked at him.